Thank you. Thank you. Hello, good evening, and welcome to Intelligence Squared. Tonight's debate is asking a very timely question. Is it time to treat China as an adversary or a partner? We're very lucky tonight to have four brilliant speakers to help us decide. But before we do, we just wanted to get a sense of where audience opinion lies before we go into the debate. So whether you're an expert or you're just a keen follower of the news, could you vote now and tell us whether you're for or against the motion, is it time to treat China as an adversary? So the motion is, it's time to treat China as an adversary. So if you're for that, please vote for. If you think we should be treating them as a partner, please vote against. You can vote by going to the link that you were sent in the email when you booked, or through the QR code you can see just behind me. If you're struggling with the QR code, we do have ushers who should be walking around with versions to help you vote. If you're watching the live stream, then you should be able to vote using the polls button on the right. If you click on that, it should bring up a series of options. If you're not sure at this stage, and hopefully we might swing your opinion one way or the other by the end of the night, but if you're not sure, please vote undecided. We'll announce the pre-vote results after we've heard the speeches. Now, tonight's debate really couldn't be more timely. We began the week with the leaders of the world descending on Glasgow. Some of the broadcast media admittedly turned up in Edinburgh, but you can't tell Americans anything. For what is currently the most important world gathering on climate change in an attempt to lower emissions and stop a terrible climate disaster. One nation was notable by its absence, not least because it's the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. China, and it's the leader of, President Xi, the leader of China, failed to turn up. The American president, Joe Biden, called it a big mistake and criticized China as a nation that wants to show leadership on big issues, but somehow missed the perfect opportunity to do it. Also, earlier this week, The Times, an excellent newspaper, reported a meeting a year ago between the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and the British ambassador for China, Caroline Wilson, in which we're told Caroline Wilson pointed out that in order to increase trade and have a stronger partnership, why can't the UK treat China like the French? It's reported. Liz Truss replied, because the French don't commit genocide. So the rhetoric is ratcheting up. Throw in tensions over Hong Kong, fears over Taiwan, and a lot of frustration over China's reluctance to aid the WHO's investigation of COVID-19 and its origins. And there are an awful lot of people at the moment you'll hear all over the media and all over politics across the West who are saying it's time we treat China as an adversary. Whilst that's what the hawks will tell you, not everyone agrees. Some people believe that cooperation with China rather than confrontation is the biggest and most important foreign policy objective of the 21st century. We're not going to defeat China in the way we defeated the USSR, they'll tell you. China will always exist, and the more hostile we are to it, the more its people are likely to be hostile to us. Unlike the USSR, China isn't trying to impose some global ideology on us. So is it time that we sort of understood and sought to manage China's interests and seek partnership in as many ways as we possibly can? Which side is right? Hopefully, by the end of tonight, you'll have made up your mind. Let's hear from our speakers. And the first speaker tonight to propose the motion, it's time to treat China like an adversary, is Nathan Law, a remarkable Hong Kong activist who's currently here in exile. Nathan, during the Umbrella Movement in 2014, was one of the 5 representatives who took part in the dialogue with the Hong Kong government debating political reform. He set up his own political party, along with the now jailed activist Joshua Wong, and he was elected as the youngest legislative councillor in Hong Kong history in 2016. He's also just written a book, which you can buy at the end of the event, called Freedom, How We Lose It and How We Get It Back. Ladies and gentlemen, Nathan Law.
When it was in 2017, I remember when I was in a Hong Kong jail because of participation in peaceful assembly. I can still remember I was treated like a number instead of a citizen. Still, I was luckier than a lot of people living in Xinjiang. Human Rights Report says that there are roughly 1.6 million to 3 million Uyghurs being locked in modern-day concentration camp. They are forcefully detained to unlearn their culture and sometimes being tortured. There are a variety of reasons why they are there. Sometimes they're just texting their foreign relatives, sometimes they're learning Uyghur language, and sometimes just being a teacher. And sometimes there are just no reasons. Some of you are professors sitting there. Being a professor and a Uyghur in China could be dangerous. Ikram Totate, a Uyghur scholar promoting moderation and reconciliation between Han Chinese and Uyghurs, was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2014. According to his friends and daughter, he is nowhere near an extremist or violence agitator. Some of you sitting down there, I can see a lot of young faces, are student activists. Joshua Wong, my best friend, who is now in jail, who was just graduated from university and the face of protest in Hong Kong, has been jailed for almost a year. The government accused him of participating in a primary election. So the government basically says that if you participate in a primary election in Hong Kong, in order to get the majority in the legislature and in order to block government's bill, you are committing a subversive action in order to overturn the government. Under this definition, every single opposition candidate in the UK will be jailed in Hong Kong. The regime has also prosecuted thousands of protesters in 2019. Some of them are prosecuted just because they chanted certain slogans. Some of them just because they uphold certain political beliefs. Ladies and gentlemen, these are all done under the Chinese Communist regime. Do you really want to partner with them? Tonight's motion is, it's time to treat China like an adversary, not a partner. How do we understand partnership? Partnership is about trust, it's about respect and identify with each other's value. So the fundamental question you should ask yourself before you vote next is China, led by totalitarian regime, Chinese Communist Party, and the dictator Xi Jinping, a trusted and respectful ally that shares similar values with us? We're not talking about war. It's a narrative that is a slippery slope, and people who want to give a free pass impunity to China use it because we've got a lot of different mechanisms to hold human rights perpetrators accountable other than going to war. It's not about Cold War-style containment strategy. We all understand that the world is so complicated, so intertwined, that it is impossible to dissect into two worlds, into two economic systems. Identifying them as adversary is to make a clear point. Human rights and freedom are our central beliefs. We should try to stop a totalitarian regime like the Chinese Communist Party to get a free pass. China as an adversary, we can still do business. We can still interact. Doing these things does not mean that we have to see them as our partner. We see the Chinese Communist Party as an adversary because it intends to dismantle democratic values by totalitarianism, attack democratic countries by sharp and soft power, and deprive their people from their democratic rights. The very first priority of the Chinese Communist Party is to retain in power at all costs, even though they have to roll over their people with tanks. In China nowadays, they are literally more sophisticated and more technologically advanced than the Orwellian state. China has the largest video surveillance system in the world, monitoring everything, including your water bill and how you walk. Social credit system is in place in some of the texting cities that it micro-controls how people behave and also persecute activists more by limiting their opportunity to travel, to take buses, to take plane. They have complete control over media. Every media outlet, there are party organs to monitor them, and let alone the gigantic internet firewall that Chinese people just cannot receive the information from external world. Propaganda, surveillance, disinformation, denial of truth, and manipulation and rewriting of the past. These are textbook characteristics of a totalitarian state, and China does it better than the one depicted in the book 1984. In 2013, the dictator Xi just assumed power and issued document number 9. It describes promoting Western constitutional democracy, promoting universal values, civil society, and free press, etc., as the 7 noteworthy problems that destabilized the hegemony of the Chinese Communist Party. These concepts have to be wiped off from their system and from the public discussion. These are just a part of the abundance of proof that from the very beginning, they see the democratic system as rivalry, as adversary. We didn't start that idea, they did. If a country is so hostile to our fundamental beliefs, do you feel like it would be possible for them to be a good partner? And their attacks is not only happening on domestic level, but on a global level. They're supporting different human rights perpetrators regime around the world, including the Myanmar military junta, who just murder people and who just conducted a coup in February, and also the North Korean leaders, and also persecuting exile activists extraterritorially, extra-legally, and also economically blackmailing countries that criticize them, like Norway, like Australia, like Lithuania. All these things combined, the Chinese Communist Party becomes the largest champion of dictators around the world. The latest Human Rights Foundation report says that it is a driving force behind global assaults on human rights. And even so, there are still people from opposition claim that China is too important and too powerful to see them as a rivalry. Of course, I understand the massiveness of China's economy, but that's the reason why we should start resisting, start to decrease our reliance, start to diversifying our economy. We've been on the wrong track to presume China would liberalize themselves for over the past decade. We should be worrying, but not appeasing, when you see such a regime become so powerful. We should act 10 years ago. We should act yesterday. We should act now. We should not wait until tomorrow before the democratic values erode so deeply that there is no turning back. If democratic countries united, we've got more than half of the global economy, and that's enough to counter Beijing's threat. In 2020, despite Beijing's economic coercion, China remains Australia's largest trading partner. Overall trade between the two nations is down just 2% in value since China's import bans. New markets were found for many Australian importers. For example, much of the wine once destined for China now comes to the UK. Standing up against the Chinese Communist regime is not a doomsday. And for some, they will say that, well, we must collaborate with China over a climate change issue. I agree this is the most fundamental, most important issue that we have to face in this era. But I really don't like the idea that we must relinquish our critics to China's human rights violation. Otherwise, they won't do nothing. It is basically not true. China themselves have strong incentive to address the problem. They have a lot of heat wave, flood, extreme weather. We've seen that on news. When we engage them before, we have solid grounds to believe that they have no intention to honor promises and treaties from their experience in WTO, South China Sea dispute, and from the situation in Hong Kong. Well, what we need is not empty words of collaboration, but developing concrete means to measure and ensure the outcome of it. We've seen so many atrocities conducted by the regime alone. And tonight is our opportunity to say enough is enough. China is not our partner. A totalitarian regime is not our power. It is not our partner and never will be. Vote for human rights, vote for democratic values, and support actions of conscience. Support Iham Todet, Joshua Wong, Jimmy Lai, Lester Shame, Edward Leung. Remember their names. They should not be forgotten. They are not numbers, they are human. Thank you so much.
Now, before we go on, just apologies. This is clearly a sign of the digital age, but I don't actually have a pen to hit the water, so I'm hitting it with my mobile phone when you've got a minute left. So take that as a sign if I start manically whacking a bottle with a phone. I'm delighted now to call up our first speaker to oppose the motion tonight. She is Shirley Yu. and she's a director of the China-Africa Initiative at the London School of Economics. She's also a senior fellow at the Ash Center of Harvard Kennedy School and a frequent speaker on China's political economy, in particular China's Belt and Road Initiative and its geopolitical implications. She's written 3 books in Chinese, On China, By Ambassadors, and The Rise of the Renminbi and the Fall of the Yen. Saved. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Shirley Yu.
Thank you, Intelligence Squared. Nathan, we're one people. I feel natural closeness with you. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I have been waiting for the past 10 months to hear the Biden administration's clear strategy on China, and this is the best I've come to understand. We must compete with China on some, collaborate on others, and confront on the rest. I call this the Biden administration's piecemeal China policy. For anyone who appreciates the long telegraph and the containment strategy that brought victory to the Cold War, we understand that policies need to be strategic, comprehensive, and clearly articulated. And today, let me ask you, does the US, the leader of the free world, sees China as an adversary or a partner? You may just tell me, it's puzzling. When the liberal global order was established in the 20th century, the United States took up nearly 50% of the global GDP. Now, with that kind of global scale, the US could absolutely build the global order according to its own image. Today, no longer. The US is about a quarter of the global GDP. China came close to about 80% of the United States, and China's economic size is already bigger than that of the EU combined. Chinese economist Justin Yifulin asked a rhetorical question. When would the United States concede to China's success? It would be when China's economy is twice the size of the United States and its per capita GDP at half of the United States. And I agree that when China gets there, it'll be almost too late for the United States to reverse course or history. The West should not treat China as an adversary. Reason 1, because the US is currently suffering from imperial overreach just as the UK did at the turn of the 20th century. The US is no longer exerting the type of global leadership that are essential to support and uphold global liberal democratic values. In July 2019, US Congress passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Acts. There were rumors at the time that the US was going to sanction Chinese banks by removing them from the international SWIFT system. And had the US done that, the Chinese banking system would have just collapsed. The US did not choose the fatal option. And instead, US Congress sanctioned a lineup of Hong Kong and Chinese senior officials. The outcome? The only pain, I think, for Carrie Lam is that she has to get reacquainted with using cash. And next week in Beijing, at the 6th plenum of the Chinese Communist Party's Congress, a new Chinese leadership lineup will be announced for the next decade. And with that, the current legislative lineup will be deemed obsolete. So the pain the US has imposed on China over Hong Kong and other issues has been so minuscule, and that's emboldened China on other territorial ambitions. In January, a coup happened in Aung San Suu Kyi's government in Myanmar. The Biden administration waged the sanctions, but the military junta is still running Myanmar. If no protection of democracy could be achieved in a small economy such as Myanmar, think about what the US can do to a large economy such as China. If that does not destroy the illusion of how much the US is actually supporting global democracy and human rights movement, I don't know what else does. So Nathan, the US's fragile support has helped co-create Hong Kong's tragedy, and maybe soon in Taiwan. The West should not treat China as an adversary because a Cold War can be peaceful and competition can be great. The US and China have been in a de facto Cold War 2.0 for a couple of years now. China is not going out to the world to build a global proletariat community as Mao Zedong once claimed, and it would be wrong to conceive today's global paradigm on an ideological basis. But Cold War 1.0 was ironically also named the Long Peace. A bipolar global order is inherently more stable than the unipolar world. Bipolarity brings not only peace, but also severe competition centered on technology. So today, China is arguably the de facto global leader on telecom infrastructure. China will soon launch the world's first major sovereign digital currency that aims at revamping the 20th century global monetary order. China's autonomous driving technology, the first widely adopted application on AI, is arguably at par with the United States. China owns 70% of the global solar energy supply chain, and most of it is located in Xinjiang. China, of the top 10 wind turbine installers in 2020, 7 were Chinese. And in 2020, China launched 1/3 of the global satellites. 2 millennia of global economic history has taught us one thing, that the world has only begun to economically take off on the back of the Industrial Revolution. So whoever owns the next global technological frontier is going to own the leadership of the 21st century. Now, competition is a great thing. During Cold War of the 20th century, US landed on the moon. We stopped that because competition was over. Now in 2024, Americans will be on the moon once again, and in the meantime, China has just launched the core capsules of its own international space station. Now, when we have the world's 2 largest powers in a fierce competition, eventually it is the whole world that are going to be the beneficiary with this level of exacerbated technological diffusion. The world should not treat China as an adversary because China is the bridge to the 21st and the 22nd century. China's technological rise is not isolated. China is bringing the developing world with it. With China's digital partnership, Rwanda, a country that suffered from genocide in 1998, has just become one of the world's top 5 fastest growing economies, according to the IMF. And in a Cuban newspaper, a headline flashed that Havana is going to have 5G before Miami. Now, think about this possibility. What about Nigeria having 5G before the UK? It would be because of China, because China's rise means the rise of the developing world. Africa by 2060 is going to have the labor force equivalent to both China and India's combined. And as China supercharges into an aging society, China will be left with no option but to deeply intertwine its industrial supply chain with ASEAN and increasingly with Africa. China today single-handedly owns 20% of Africa's debt, builds 1/3 of Africa's power infrastructure. China finances in various degrees 46 ports across sub-Saharan Africa. And China has built submarine infrastructure to provide high-speed internet to the continent. Now, on the contrary, we see consistent US FDI outflow out of Africa. If the West isolates China, then how does the West connect with the 21st century global economic reality that is going to be led by Asia and the 22nd century increasingly led by Africa? The last point, why the West should not treat China as an adversary is because China, by definition, will evolve over time. Chinese history has shown that it's extended over 20 major dynastic periods, starting from approximately 2 millennia BC. And in some of these dynastic periods, of course, China was divided into 5 or 10 kingdoms at the same time. The People's Republic of China, as you may say, is the 21st major ruling period of the Chinese landmass. And now, without a doubt, this won't be the last ruling polity in China or the end of history for China. What has given the Chinese Communist Party the ruling legitimacy, has been the consistent rise of economic prosperity. The current plan is by 2035, China's per capita GDP is going to hit 20,000 US dollars, putting China solidly in a high-income country status. Now, if there were a concept of social contract, and by the way, there is not, it would be exchange of economic prosperity for social stability. But there is a danger that the Chinese government may not consistently continue to produce that economic prosperity. So China will remain a vulnerable power filled with many domestic challenges, and I would suggest that the West, let's just stay chill. By 2050, let's give China the benefit of the time and let China mature, and I can guarantee you by 2050, the China that we will be dealing with will be a very different China from the one that we see today. Fukuyama once said that human history must be seen not as a succession of civilizations or succession of economic accomplishments. More importantly, it must be seen as a succession of different forms of consciousness. We are on a learning curve together. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. And now our third speaker tonight is another speaker for the motion. For the motion, it's time to treat China as an adversary rather than a partner. And I'm really glad tonight to be able to introduce you to Alan Mendoza, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, the foreign policy and national security think tank, which promotes freedom and liberty. Alan is also a columnist for the City AM, London's business newspaper, and is a frequent commentator for the BBC, Sky, Bloomberg, every respectable. Everyone wants a piece of Alan, so we're delighted he could join us tonight.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very warm introduction. And I want to start this evening, ladies and gentlemen, by focusing on the actual words in the motion itself, or the language of the motion, because it asks us whether we should be considering China as a partner or an adversary. And I think those are important terms, because the real definition of being a partner is not merely one of being engaged neutrally with another person or entity, but the sense that you share something much bigger with them, a commonality across various areas that you are consciously working towards building something better as a unit than you could do separately. Think of a business partner, for example, or even, dare I say, and I see a few of those, a romantic partner even. Would you feel that those are people who had your joint best interests at heart? Of course you would. Would they be people you respected for the way they behaved? Absolutely. Would they be people you trusted completely? Of course, the answer is yes. Now contrast that with the behavior of an adversary. That is someone who you are invariably engaged in competition with. And I think actually Shirley pointed out all the areas of competition which will drive us towards landing on the moon again, but they are areas of competition nonetheless with a country that is clearly an adversary. Would you feel that such a country had your best interests at heart? Of course not. Do you think you would admire the way they behaved? Not at all. Would you trust them? Absolutely not. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Because the plain fact is that when you consider the reality of China today and its regime, it is clearly in the adversary camp and not in the partnership. And I think it is important to state, as was said at the start actually, this is the Chinese regime we are talking about, the Communist Party of China, not the Chinese people, many of whom would agree that the state is antithetical to its interests and hates them because of the way it controls them, if only they had a chance to express themselves. Because of course, ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that in 2021, China is an oppressive police state and a surveillance state. Now, back in the old Cold War days, there was a joke. You would go to a hotel in the Soviet Union, if you're a foreign diplomat, you'd turn up, there'd be no towels, and you'd say, stand in the middle of the room, talk to yourself, there are no towels in this room. And suddenly a flunky would appear at the door a few minutes later with towels. That was Soviet-style surveillance. Today in China, it is much more advanced than that. Your thoughts are monitored on the internet, your words are checked out in social messaging apps. Everything is monitored to make sure that you do not divert from the party line. And if you do divert from that line, you risk losing benefits, or you risk being taken away. You could even risk never be seen again. That is the nature of China today. And that is, of course, if you are part of the majority Han Chinese population. If you happen to be one of those poor, unfortunate people who are a group the Chinese state wishes to subjugate, like the Uyghurs, like the Tibetans, like the Falun Gong, your fate is much worse. Those freedom fighters in Tibet risk constant arrest and torture for their actions. If you're the Falun Gong, you have to go deep into private life to practice your beliefs. And of course, if you're a Uyghur, you face the prospect of slavery in concentration camps and worse, acts of genocide that we know have been taking place in Xinjiang province. Now, I ask you, look at that for 1 second. Think about it. Is that the behavior of a partner you would like, or is it the behavior of an adversary that you actually face? Because those are not the values of this country, but they are the values of China today. But perhaps you need more convincing. So let's take a look at COP26, just in the news. Of course, efforts made internationally by many countries to try and counter the terrible threat of climate change. Now, China is the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, and it is responsible for 25% of the world's total emissions. Yet its president chose not to attend the conference and instead gave a mealy-mouthed statement that merely restated current commitments of China. And China's national emissions plan is widely regarded as not being anywhere near enough to keep the global temperature from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And equally, if you look at what China has done in recent weeks, it has, of course, not signed up to the methane emissions treaty that many would like to join. 80 countries did, China didn't. And, of course, it's decided to start firing up coal power stations. Now, why is it doing that? Because it needs to for its own economic interests. So here we are sitting in the UK at Glasgow, trying to act in the world's interest, and China, once again, acting in its own interests. Why? Because it's an adversary, not a partner. Partners work together, adversaries work in their own interest, and China, once again, has demonstrated that. But okay, let's take that aside. Let's try another arena. Let's look at how China's neighbours and our other friends in the region view that country. Would that give us some confidence about China's true intentions? Unfortunately not. Wherever you look in the East and South China Seas, China generates only fear and concern about its behaviour. Whether it is seizing or building islands in its neighbourhood in breach of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or sparring with countries like Japan, South Korea and the Philippines, China's aggressive bullying behaviour should give us cause for concern about where our own relationship might be headed. Pity poor Australia, which was hit with a barley and wine boycott for having the temerity suggest that there should be a proper investigation into the origins of COVID-19, which even the World Health Organization now says is impossible to conduct because of the opposition of the Chinese regime to allowing us to understand what really went on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology in those days before coronavirus began to run riot around the world. And spare a thought for Taiwan, a true partner to this country, constantly menaced by the Chinese military and Chinese diplomatic maneuvers designed to threaten and cow that country into submission, for daring to suggest it might be better off as an independent nation rather than reunited under the communist jackboot. Partner or adversary? Our other friends would say very much the latter. And then there is the IP theft and industrial espionage that China engages on an industrial scale. Would you trust a country that stole from you? Because that is what China does to countries who once saw themselves as partners. The US Independent and Bipartisan Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property estimated that IP theft costs the US between $225 and $600 billion annually. That's 1.3% to 3% of US GDP. And in its report, the IP Commission was clear where the blame lay, stating unequivocally that China is the world's principal IP infringer. And in case you're feeling left out here as a British audience sitting here in London tonight, in December 2018, the National Cyber Security Centre announced that a group of Chinese hackers, known as APT-10, acted on behalf of the Chinese Ministry of State Security to carry out a malicious cyber campaign targeting intellectual property in the UK. And its advisory note, that body revealed that the UK was a significant target of AP-10. Perhaps this is why the British and US governments have banned the involvement of Chinese companies like Huawei from involvement in critical infrastructure projects, because they believe it is too great a risk to have Chinese involvement in them. Hardly the behaviour expected of a country regarded as a partner, much more that of an adversary. I could go on. I could cite the fact that China recently engaged in threats against British naval vessels, excising the right of freedom of navigation in international waters near China, or that China has placed sanctions on British members of parliament, former colleagues of Sir Vince, who have dared to call out its behaviour. But I don't think I need to, because the plain fact is that many of us in this room will feel that doubts about China's intentions have grown, not diminished, in recent years, and are likely to grow still further. The China of 2050 that was spoken of, is that a China more likely to be our friend or our enemy? I'm afraid the direction of travel is clear, and that is why I hope you will listen to those voices that have said tonight what China is really about, and agree with this side of the House that China today, and even more importantly, China tomorrow, is an adversary and not a partner. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I'm delighted now to announce our final speaker tonight, Sir Vince Cable, MP for Twickenham for over 20 years, leader of the Liberal Democrats between 2017 and 2019, and he was the Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills in the coalition government between 2010 and 2015, and the President of the Board of Trade. Vince has also written a number of books, including his latest, which will be available at the end of the event tonight, called The Chinese Conundrum, Engagement or Conflict, examining the long history of China and the West.
Well, ladies and gentlemen. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I agree with the previous speaker that the debate hinges on what we mean by partnership. And I want to start with the economic arguments and repeat some of what Cindy said earlier. That if we go back half a century, we had in China, some of the utter horrors of the modern world. Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. This was a country characterized as it had been for a century with famine, hunger, poverty, and chaos. But Deng and his successors converted China into a successful capitalist economy, and in the process turned China into what is now the biggest economy in the world on some measures, biggest trading partner in the world, the biggest recipient of foreign investment. And China is the future of the world economy, followed by India in due course. And it's self-indulgent to the point of silliness to believe that we can do any other than seriously engage with a country of this kind. And I spent 5 years in government trying to do that, and we had good outcomes. We still have an integrated steel industry. The Chinese firm bought Scunthorpe from Tata Steel. We will have an electric vehicle industry because the Chinese company is building one of the biggest battery companies in the world in the northeast of England. Jaguar Land Rover's vast sales and profits in China have helped that company to expand the industry in the West Midlands. AstraZeneca has provided our vaccine on the back of massive sales and profits in China. I'm based in a university, and British university students' expansion has been financed by 125,000 Chinese students every year coming and paying commercial fees. But that's a bit parochial. If you look at it from a global standpoint, it was actually the Chinese, along with Gordon Brown and Obama, who refloated the world economy after the crash and the banks collapsed. The Chinese have consistently, over 4 decades, used their vast holdings of American dollars to keep the world monetary system stable, to prevent currency wars. It wasn't the Chinese, it was the last President of the United States, and probably the next one, who systematically tried to sabotage the world trading system on which the prosperity of rich and poor countries depends. And coincidentally, right now, the Chinese are, amid this plethora of economic announcements, opening their economy, as they've been urged by Westerners to do, to the financial sector. Biggest banks in the world, the BlackRocks and JP Morgans, right now are being given free range to go into China, set up institutions, buy up shares for Western investors. But of course, it's not all economics. We've heard about human rights, and China is authoritarian, extremely authoritarian, can be brutal. There's no point trying to conceal that. I don't conceal it. But what we have to look at is the balance between, on the one hand, their enormous advances in economic and social rights, and the very, very lamentable record in human rights. And in fact, China ranks above only Saudi Arabia in the Freedom House classification of human rights abuses. Saudi, of course, being one of our close partners economically and militarily. But it is there are many rights abuses, of course, there's no doubt about that. But there's one fact to remember. Before the COVID restrictions came in, every year, 130 million Chinese left China to work, to study, to shop, do their tourism. At the end of it, they went back freely. And it's worthwhile remembering that the Henry Jackson Institute was set up in the name of an American senator who campaigned against the Soviet Union because they wouldn't let people out. The Chinese do let people out. They go and they come back. And they consent to do so. So this is an authoritarian regime, but of a particular kind that commands the support of a large number of its own people. But the concern that's been expressed on the panel is the way it looks to the rest of the world. And in a caricatured form, you often say, China's militaristic, it's aggressive, it's trying to conquer the world. It's worth noting the Chinese spend 2% of their national product on defense, the same as we do, NATO average. The Americans, I'm a great fan of the United States, have 200 military bases around the world. The Chinese have 2. They are, a little-known fact, the largest contributor to United Nations peacekeeping. So there is a lot of aggressive language, but the reality is a bit different. And President Xi set out his stall very clearly 10 years ago when he became president. He said, look, China is like this. We don't export terrorism. We're not sending you hungry refugees. We don't mess with you. Don't mess with us. Okay, it's crude, but it's a very clear statement of a Chinese approach to the rest of the world, which is non-interference and territorial integrity, which accounts for the position they take on Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan. And it has a lot of support in the rest of the world. We feel there's lots of moral indignation in the UK about China, but when the American administration, the Trump administration, alleged for the first time about the abuse of Muslims in Xinjiang, leading to extermination on some claims, and there undoubtedly is human rights abuse, every single Islamic majority country in the world of any substance, including the democratically elected Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, supported the Chinese position. Why would they do that? But the argument is not fundamentally about non-interference. It is about partnership to solve common problems. And just my final comment is this, that we have a whole series of international public goods, common headaches. Global warming is one, pandemics is another, nuclear proliferation is probably the most serious of all. Now, without China, we cannot begin to solve these problems. You know, our existence depends on having a partnership with them. And you can argue about whether the Chinese or the Americans made the biggest lack of contribution to the climate talk, but actually, they have to work together and they have to cooperate. Otherwise, these problems will never be solved. So that's why I believe we have to form a partnership. A new Cold War doesn't help anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince, and thanks to all of our speakers tonight. We are about to open the debate up to the audience, so do feel free to send in your questions. If you're watching the live stream, you can do that by clicking on the Q&A button. Do type in your question. If you want to, add your name and where you're tuning in from. It's always nice to know. If you're in the room, in a slightly sort of post-COVID gesture, we want you to, rather than putting your hands up, would you mind just coming and queuing behind one of the mics here? We'll form an orderly queue. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible. Before we do that, though, I just want to announce the results of the pre-vote that we did at the start of the session. And it looks very much at the start of tonight's event that for the motion, so people do think we should be treating China as an adversary by 53%. Against, people for partnership was 22%. Undecided, 25%, so there's still an opportunity there for you. Let's see where we get to by the end of the night. We're already getting a queue, which is great. Do keep coming if you have any questions at all. But could we begin with you?
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Shirley and Vince just one question. What's the single thing you'd want China to change to be easier to partner with?
Maybe I'll go first. China has developed enormous hard power, needless to say, both economic power but also military power. But China has not yet matured with its soft power. The West has tremendous amount of soft power. And so if China needs to learn one thing and grow maturely on the global stage, it would be that China needs to learn and develop its soft power. I'll give you one quick example. In the recent post-COVID-19 world, China continues to talk about win-win solutions. When we talked about relieving African debt, China said, well, we prefer to resort to African debt issues on a bilateral level on a win-win basis. Now, Condoleezza Rice, former US Secretary of State, said once, if China wants to be the global leader, let it. Because unless China becomes one, China would not understand the sacrifices it takes to be a global leader. And China, needless to say, if China does aspire to take on the global leadership responsibility, then China needs to understand the world is no longer about win-win. It is about lose-win, because it takes true leadership to lose in order for the rest of the world to win.
Vince?
Well, it's a slightly flippant answer, but I would say probably the most important thing they need at the moment is good public relations advice. They've got terrible at presenting themselves, actually. There is a very good defense. Well, I've written a book. You can form your judgment as to what role it performs. But, actually, the little factoid I mentioned about participating in UN peacekeeping, the fact that their military defense is very, very limited, except in some highly specialized high-tech areas. They've started using this, rather foolishly in my view, this wolf warrior communication system, which none of us understand. It's a peculiar use of language. And it's very off-putting and gives the impression that the Chinese are highly aggressive, which is actually not the case.
I'm actually going to extend that question to this side too. Is there, what would need to change in China for you to think they'd be a good partner now?
It's government. I mean, basically...
I mean, I was hoping you weren't going to go.
No. Think about it. No, this is really... Vince has given you this wonderful impression that China is this benign power. Why certain majority Muslim nations didn't vote on the Uyghur issue? Because China has literally bought them with billions of dollars of economic development aid in the Belt and Road Initiative. That government is the source of problems, and until China is not a communist state, it cannot be a partner.
Nathan, is there one thing? Is it human rights? Is it sort of more protection for citizens of Hong Kong? What is the one thing that would make China a much easier partner?
Well, definitely the government. I think this is the perfect answer.
I was afraid you'd say that.
If we look at what the opposition has been saying, they're saying that they're economic superior, so that we have to see them as partner. But they forgot one thing is when bad people, when malign force have more power, they're actually doing more damage to the world. And that's why we should start thinking about like what are their systems and what they're using the power with their economic power in the world, and how we can hold them accountable when they do such a lot of human rights violation around the world. And I think this is exactly the problems that we should ask.
Now I'm going to ask a question from the left. Before I do, if there are any women who'd like to ask questions, please do come forward too. Don't feel you can't.
I would like to ask the opinion of each of the panel, why each of them feels why there are so few Chinese faces here this evening.
It's a very interesting question. I think we'll start with Nathan.
Sorry, so few Chinese faces.
Why are there so few Chinese faces here this evening?
So I've had a lot of talks in universities, and there were a lot of times that Chinese students approached me and to talk to me after the talk, because they were worried that when they are present and they're being spotted and they are being turned to the embassy or anything, that they could get in trouble. Sir Vince just said that there are lots of Chinese people going out and coming back, but we just have to remember that these people, even though they're overseas, they're continuously being monitored. They are having a lot of connections in their country. Whenever they create troubles, there will be calls to their families. Their family's door will be knocked, and there will be police or any sort of these thing to come up and to threaten them. So this is a concrete worries for them, even though they're outside of the country.
Vince, is that some?
Yes, well, I teach quite large numbers of Chinese students. I'm at the same institution as Cindy. They're very forthcoming. They speak freely, ask intelligent questions. I guess the reason they're not here, we actually have a very small Chinese minority in the UK. Probably if we had a more liberal approach to immigration, we would see more of them.
If I may just add, it could also be because of COVID-19 restrictions. I almost didn't make it tonight, traveling from the United States back to the UK. But also, there is certainly a trend of human capital decoupling between China and the Western world. There's no doubt about it.
Shirley, do you worry, as Nathan said, that people would be afraid to come to a forum like this, to be seen?
Oh, I'm sure many will be afraid. Of course, I teach at Harvard Kennedy School, and of course, you know that the past year we have to do lecturing online. And so I was told, just as a general cautionary note, that don't ever assume that the Zoom will not be off the record. It's just on the record. And what that means is that a lot of the Chinese students who are participating in political debates at universities back at home in China, they may be cautious about what they speak.
Is that alarming? Is that something that makes it harder for us to work as partners, given it's such a different culture?
It's the reality.
Alan, anything to add?
Well, I think Shirley is a sleeper for the proposition here tonight. I mean, she's telling you exactly why the Chinese regime is such a disaster and why we can't possibly be a partner with them if even Chinese students daren't speak in public. But it is, look, the surveillance issue is a real one. It's very important. China monitors people abroad as well as at home. There's a case in the US right now where the US authorities have accused China of surveilling dissidents in the US. That's a reality. This is not the behavior of a partner.
However, Alan, may I just come back just to defend my position? We have to learn from Harvard something. I was at Harvard 2 weeks ago, and I was so happy to see many Chinese faces there. Can you imagine the enormous amount of pressure for the elite universities in the United States today to accept Chinese students, to come to the US to debate about these fundamental political issues? We have to give them a lot of credits to have the guts to continue to welcome Chinese students, and we have to welcome and engage with China. There is no other option than that.
We will come to you in just a moment, but actually, because I called for them, I sort of feel like we should just give one of the women a chance first. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this. So my question is, first of all, I was very surprised by the results. I find them very emotional. I would personally propose partnership. But my question is, we've talked a lot about the US, but what's your view on the European Union, and also in a post-Brexit era, what's the view on how the UK and the EU should be working on defining a partnership with China? Because I think post-Trump, we're also alone in this. So I'd love to understand, for a good partnership, there needs to be, two sides, and the US has mentioned a fair bit, but really love to understand more about EU, UK, and how we're gonna get there together.
Well, Vince, we'll start with you.
Well, yes, I think putting it in a post-Brexit context is a very good one. I mean, I think if Britain wanted to be in the comfortable position of always dealing with countries with the same values and same standards, we should have stayed in the European Union, but we didn't, and we're now a global Britain, which means we have to engage with the world as it actually is outside. And we tend to forget, I mean, there's a lot of, pontificating about China, but some of Britain's closest economic and defense relationships are with countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and Egypt, Turkey, which have human rights records which in some cases are as bad or worse than with China. I mean, that's the world we have to deal with. I'm afraid just shutting it out. I mean, just a quick rejoinder to an early point. People that are indignant that the Chinese are lending money to Africa. Why are they lending money to Africa? Because we have walked away, right? Britain's cut its aid program, Western multinationals have pulled out, there's a vacuum, the Chinese have advanced capital for development because nobody else will. And then we lecture the Chinese and say they're behaving badly. I mean, there's extraordinary self-righteousness here, which is totally unacceptable.
Alan, I'm going to go to you. Do you accept Vince's point? In a post-Brexit world, we now have to take partnerships wherever we can get them.
No one is saying that we shouldn't engage with China. I mean, no one on this side would say boycott China, go to war with China. That's not what we're saying. We're saying be alive as to the reality of who you are dealing with. And Vince mentioned certain regimes who we aren't particularly proud of our human rights records, yet we still deal with them. The reality is that we know what those regimes are all about. We know, and there are limits as a result to how closely we do act with them. And that's really where the EU is going to have to go with China as well. It's going to obviously have to trade with China. No one suggests that's not a good thing. However, must it trade in China in key strategic industries where national security of various countries are engaged with? You discover that China actually ends up with a monopoly, or at least a large proportion of some of the most key components to a nation's security. That's not a sensible place to be once you've identified it's not really a true partner and adversary. Okay, trade with it in certain goods, but let's not pretend that we can avoid where that country's real likely interests are. They won't be aligned with us. We therefore need to protect ourselves. So it's a realistic engagement. It's understanding China's a big country, we want to be part of it, but we must make sure we are not so intertwined that should there be a crisis, we are not held hostage to what the Chinese do, because we've seen it so many times before. The Australian case is just one example of how China punishes countries who don't agree with it. And that's a bad news for everyone in that sense.
So can I just quickly respond to this national security issue, because the issue of Huawei and 5G was raised earlier. And I happened to deal with this in government over a 5-year period, and was repeatedly reassured by the intelligence community, who should know, that our dealings were totally safe. And the same judgment was followed by Theresa May when she succeeded the government I was in. And the reason we have disengaged from China and Huawei and 5G has got nothing to do with British national security. It's because we were told by the Americans that we had to. And the Germans, who took a view in their national interest, have kept with 5G. And as if Britain had, we would now be at the forefront of countries using the most advanced telecommunications technology, and we're not.
No, I have to come back on that. I'm sorry, I have to come back on that because that's a point of view. However, the other point of view is quite clearly that having a company which has, which would be, of course, responsible to the Chinese government if at any moment it wanted data and control of that company, being part of your communications network is a disaster for this country. We've seen examples where Chinese companies have been told what to do by the Chinese state. That's not a place for any country which has serious national security issues to allow such a company to control its 5G network. And that's why Britain did not do it. Nothing to do with American pressure in that regard.
So am I taking from here that the EU, the UK don't have a strategy to engage? Because it seems ping-pongy.
Should I jump in this question?
Yeah.
Well, I think if we're talking partnership as if we're saying China, there are no problems in China and there are no problems in the way that we engage with them for the past decades, and that's something that I don't agree with. We have to engage with it, but we have to see how they abuse that kind of like trading relationship and their power over the world to conduct all sorts of bad behaviors, including they're using forced labor to export the solar panel, they're using forced labor to do work on Xinjiang cotton. They're doing a lot of economic blackmailing to countries like Norway when after the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo, they blocked their trade even though it was not about the government but the institute. But the Chinese government still do so, still using their belligerent behavior in order to silence the other countries. If you look at the case of Australia, the propaganda machine is describing Australia as the gum under the shoes. And that's the reason why we have to work on defining that as adversary in order to work on these problems until we've got a respectable and we've got a relationship that both sides agree on. And this is the result why we are not talking about partnership now, but we should have made some change.
Thank you. We will come back to some of the questions here. I just wanted to ask a quick one from some of our online audience. We've got a question that's come in saying, how can we make China accountable if another pandemic emerges from the country? Shirley, do you want to take that?
Oh, I remember when COVID-19 first broke out in spring of 2020, we had a lecture at the LSE where we had a conversation with Larry Summers from Harvard Kennedy School. Larry was amazing, and he said, look, this sort of pandemic, the world has to be prepared for it to come back once every decade or so. And that is fundamentally because of rapid urbanization all across the developing world, and particularly in Asia Pacific. And if you look at ASEAN economies, they are rising very quickly. Indonesia, I think the GDP growth is like 5.5%. And so with rapid urbanization, there is a higher need of protein consumption, and the human and animal interactions are going to become more intense. It may not break out in China, it might break out in another developing country, but I think the world would have to be prepared that there will be more these type of virus that will eventually spread into a global pandemic. And what that calls for are proactive responses. You see, the global governments they tend to be reactive when emergency happens. And I should say that I see many masks in this room, and we are still suffering from the aftermath of COVID-19. And that that really calls for multilateral organizations and the national governments to really set up proactive responses in order to protect the citizens' livelihood when the next one hits. And that China is included as well.
Should there be more accountability, though? Should they be doing more to enable the current investigation into the origins, and how do we trust them to be more open next time?
It's interesting because President Biden has announced a 90 days, I believe, independent investigation of the origins of COVID-19. And I believe that result was released sometime at the beginning of September. And then there was the UN General Assembly where President Biden, President Xi Jinping were both present via video. It's just almost as if this whole COVID investigation disappeared from the universe. No one seemed to talk about it. And today, we seem to have gone past that era of accusing one another. But I think as rational citizens, what we really ought to do is not to say that, the effect, of course, we need to continue to investigate because that helps us to prevent the next pandemic from happening. But we really ought to hold our own governments and these global multilateral organizations accountable.
Vince, was there anything you wanted to add? How do we make China accountable the next time there's a pandemic?
Sorry?
The question was, how can we make China accountable if another pandemic emerges from China?
Well, as far as the last pandemic is concerned, the Biden administration just, as you know, just set up an investigation into it and established that an accidental leak was perfectly plausible, but the most likely outcome, almost certainly, was that it was zootonic transmission. It was an unfortunate accident. The Chinese did spend 2 weeks covering up what was going on, which was highly reprehensible, but they then cooperated fully in getting to the DNA of the molecule and cooperating in solving this problem. And as you know from the recent crackdown in the last few weeks, they're now taking this disease a lot more seriously than we are. So yeah, I mean, we have no alternative but to cooperate. I mean, it's like climate change, like nuclear proliferation. These are common problems. The Chinese accept that they are party to it. They're, unlike some administrations, they're guided by science. They do serious research. And one little detail that was forgotten in all the arguments about Wuhan was that the Wuhan Institute, where this leak may have occurred, was a joint project with the United States, which Mr. Fauci, who was the head of public medicine in the United States, was overseeing. So if there was a failure, it was shared. It wasn't unique to the Chinese. So responsibility is widely spared here. Let's not just go around pointing fingers.
You've waited a while. Do step.
Hi. So my name is Rafi, and I'm here from City of London School today. Thank you very much. It's been really fascinating debate so far. I wanted to pick up on something Shirley mentioned in your speech. You said at the very beginning about, you used the imperial overreach to refer to the USA, and in doing so you draw a parallel between the US at the moment and Britain at the turn of the century. Now the thing is, between the sort of changeover of global domination between Britain and America is that these two countries shared fundamentally a similar view of the world, and as the proposition defined partnership so well, Britain and the UK are very close partners. So my question is, and the thing is nowadays, is that China, as again the proposition outlined, is a country that should have very different values to us. And I think that the Western society that we have created is something we should be proud of. The free society we've created is a moral achievement, and we shouldn't forget that, and it is something we should be proud of. But the question is actually posed to the proposition, because I agree we should treat China as an adversary, but when we're seeing political division and countries turning inwards, looking at themselves, Trump won on a campaign of America first, how can the West regain its sense of unity to properly treat China as an adversary, as it should?
Alan, do you want to take
Well, actually, I think firstly, good to see a citizen. It's marvellous to have you here with us, being an old citizen myself. But leave that for 1 second. let's look at what you just said about, our own divisions. What's fascinating is that, say in the US today, which is perhaps the most divided, if you like, of our political societies, what is the one issue, the sole issue, on which there is a genuine bipartisan consensus? Guess what? It's China. It's fascinating, actually, that the Democrats and the Republicans both seen this issue as one which is the biggest threat to global sort of stability going forwards. And together, they have senators, congressmen, even the presidents have both accepted that China is that threat. So I think this tells you something significant. It means that even with our own divisions in our current contemporary political alliance, and the same, by the way, is true here. If you look at the Labour front bench, you'll see lots of criticism of China. Tory front bench, the same. You end up with a consensus on this one issue. And that should tell you that people have woken up to the reality of what China is. They're convinced they have to do something about it. It doesn't matter what party you're from, action needs to be taken.
Now, we are almost running out of time, but I just want to try and get a couple of very quick questions in. So, do you want to ask yours?
Yeah, so, hi. Thanks for the debate so far. So, I'd like to ask, I think the opposition suggested that the past of China suggests they would eventually change and become more democratic. But surely we've tried for like a golden decade. We had Xi Jinping come and meet with the Queen, etc., and including under the coalition. And there's been no change, but just an increase in hostility in Taiwan, threats against Australia, Hong Kong, and genocide in Xinjiang. What makes you think this time, or any time in the future, will be different?
So that's a quick one for Vince, I think, given that you were a member of the coalition.
I'm not hearing these questions.
As a member of the coalition, during that period with David Cameron and George Osborne, where China was being welcomed in, there were state visits, the doors were very much open to a partnership, we don't seem to have made very much progress on stopping genocide or on sort of building up a relationship that sort of functions. I think that's a quick summary.
Sorry, the acoustics are just awful.
So during your time in the coalition, when David Cameron and George Osborne were opening the doors to China, it doesn't seem to have made much difference in our ability to change Chinese behavior or influence them in terms of the problems of the Uyghurs or climate change.
Well, we weren't trying to tell them how to run their own country. We were trying to conduct business with them in a practical and equitable way, and I gave some examples as how this has worked out productively. But as it happens, I was in meetings with, actually one meeting with the president of China, Hu Jintao, who preceded Xi, and the issue of Tibet was raised, and it was raised in a proper and respectful way. We notified them that this was a problem that some people in Britain were concerned about, and they responded. And providing they were not we were trying to ambush them or humiliate them, they're perfectly capable of engaging with these issues. I had a very long conversation, about a half-an-hour conversation, with a man who's now in the Politburo and will, I think, probably be the next one of the premiers, Chua Hua, about human rights in the labour force, because I was responsible here for minimum wage and all that. And I made the point to them that you're a socialist country, supposedly, but there aren't very many labour rights. And I'm in a wicked capitalist country, and we have minimum wages and protection of trade unions and so on. And he didn't, throw up his hands and say, I refuse to discuss it. We had a perfectly sensible discussion based on the fact that, China is evolving. Many of the things I was discussing with him are now being implemented in China as part of their so-called common prosperity move. They actually asked me to send literature from the UK on how we were dealing with minimum wage enforcement. And my experience of dealing with the top Chinese on issues of this kind is that providing we're not presenting ourselves as a sort of patronizing Westerners lecturing them on how to run their country, but treat them as a great power and equals and with respect, you can have a perfectly sensible discussion about where we go. There is an issue about respect and about face, which we have to understand if you're dealing with China, but it can be done, and we did it.
Very quickly, we are completely out of time, but I just want to give one more question. I'm so sorry to everybody else. We've completely run out of time.
I guess this makes me a really brave Chinese by the definition
That's
of
why
the
I really
opposition.
wanted to get you in.
So, one question, very simple one. So, like, I can see the argument say that, because they don't share our same belief or value, a liberal democratic society. But do we really want to see China as a liberal democratic society? Do we really want to see another Trump? Do we really want to see another AfD in Deutschland and another Le Pen in France? Let me remind you, China is running very high on nationalism. People are populistic, and they will elect leaders to have, a strong leader that might be stronger in terms of nationalistic views than Xi Jinping right now. So I guess it's the question for both sides. Thank you.
Well, I'll start with Alan. You called for an end of this government. Do you think you've asked for, better the devil you know? You asked for
no, definitely not. When that devil happens to be a genocidal authoritarian regime that enslaves hundreds of millions. Of course not. Look, the reality is, China had a great moment of democracy potential in 1989. And what happened? The tanks literally crushed the democracy protesters. They literally killed them. Okay, that's the reality of it. And since that time, the Chinese Communist Party has been ruthless in its maintenance of power and its desire to control its people. And it's only getting worse, not better, because the internet age and the surveillance afforded makes China an even more susceptible country to surveillance by this regime. And that's your real problem. You've got a state, an authoritarian state that's getting more authoritarian, not less, and more dangerous as a result.
Can I just add something really quickly? That's actually a really profound question. I just had this conversation with a Harvard professor recently about Vladimir Putin in Russia. And so the idea is that, the whole post-Cold War era, people have been hoping for a liberal Russia. And then we got Putin. But his conclusion is that we should be happy because in 10 years' time, the person presiding over Russia might be even more authoritarian than Putin. And then in 10 years' time, we're going to be so happy to say, oh my God, that was the golden era when we had Putin. So it's really interesting. I think the West is totally unprepared today about what's going to happen to China next, because there is a clear directional shift during Xi Jinping era, particularly this year, on the cusp of the second century of the Chinese Communist Party. Now there is a strong sense of renationalization. China is definitely turning towards the left. But who will be the successor? And that potential successor one day might be even more on the left to Xi Jinping. And then how does the West respond? And so I think we really are in a steep learning curve, and we ought to put in a lot of realistic thinking about how to realistically deal with China that is possibly going to increasingly become more prosperous. But we are uncertain if China will increasingly become more liberal or not.
Just very briefly, Nathan.
Yeah, just one word. In order to clarify your statement, we should have an election in China if they are so popular. By the time you and I can vote, and we will see the result of it.
A bit of hope. We've just got time now. I'm so sorry. We've just got time to move to the closing statements. I'm going to invite Vincent first to, just in a minute, sum up your side of the argument.
Well, I just, in the 2 minutes I have, perhaps just rehearse what I said at the end of my original comments, which is to try to focus on those issues where we have common threats and the need to build partnerships to deal with them. I mean, the whole week has been filled with COP and climate change, and rightly it's an existential problem. And there's a lot of finger-pointing. You know, the Chinese are the biggest emitters. Well, actually, in cumulative terms, they certainly aren't. But anyway, regardless of who is to blame, there are many things that, the Americans are doing positively and others that they failed to do on coal. The Chinese have actually made a commitment and are now implementing carbon pricing, which has proved too difficult in the West, particularly the States. They have banned the export of coal generation power stations. They have got the biggest renewable power sector in the world, and they're putting it to use. But if we're operating in a Cold War environment, in which there is no cooperation and China is treated as a threat. And we're obsessed, for example, by the intellectual property around solar power rather than actually how you share it, then this problem is not going to be solved. And it is a horrendous issue. I'm personally much more concerned about another problem, which is nuclear proliferation. We have issues of North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, and the Taliban. The Chinese, as it happens, have an entree to those governments which we don't have. They could, if they were minded and we worked with them, act in a restraining and helpful way, or they could make mischief. We don't know. But it is in everybody's interest that we actually do work with them. And the rules of the world international economic system that has made this country and the rest of the world prosperous in the last 70 years is in serious peril. The World Trade System, the monetary system, it needs stable governance, and the Americans led it for this time, and they've generally led it pretty well until Trump. But we've now got two economic superpowers, and they're going to have to share responsibility, and the Chinese are going to have to be given equal status, and they will do it in their own way, with Chinese characteristics. But we need them as partners. There is no other way that we can deal with these problems without them. Thank you.
Vince. Alan, just in a minute.
Absolutely. Right, 2 questions for you. The first question is, do you, deep down, think about it carefully, do you feel more worried about China internationally and domestically than you did 5 years ago today? I think deep down, all of us somewhere feel that the answer will likely be yes to that. And if that is the case, you don't, that's very interesting. Well, I'd love to know later why. After all the bullying, the harassment, the international threats, the breaking of international law, the economic exploitation, the genocide, after all of that, okay, we can talk about it. We can talk about it. Now, the second question, whether you answered yes or no to the first, given the direction of travel, think about 5-10 years' time. Do you think China is going to be more or less of a threat internationally and domestically than before? And the answer, indisputably, on this side of the House is yes, it will be. And if you do believe that, then you surely have the obligation to think about this carefully and go, that means it's an adversary and not a partner. Adversary doesn't mean you cut off contact with it. You've still got to engage and you've still got to do things, but be realistic about where that country is heading, and it is not to a good destination.
Thanks, Alan. Just in a minute, Shirley, your case?
Alan is a great campaigner, but let me appeal to some reason here. In the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides said, the norm of the state is that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. 600 years ago, world economic gravity has shifted from the Eurasian continent, or the inner crescent of the world, to the outer crescent, to the Atlantic region. And now we are starting to see the world's economic gravity shifting back to the Eurasian continent. But for that few centuries, we have had the liberal democratic values that have essentially defined the world, and we have been living in a cozy Pax Americana world for the past 7+ decades. Pax Americana and Pax Britannica were amazing golden eras of our world history, but they are not the global norm. In the post-Pax Americana world, before the US and China definitively wins that in this global economic race until we see a definitive winner, the world is going to be fundamentally dominated by Hobbesian values. That is, international relations will be once again governed by anarchy and the power insecurity. And in this Hobbesian world, international relations, national interest matters, and balance of power matters.
Nathan. Final word.
In 1989, after the Taiwan massacre, a lot of the foreign countries indeed input a lot of boycotts in China and have arms embargoes and a lot of different measures. UK was among one of them who were the very first to ease the relationship, to warm the relationship. In the year 2001, China joined WTO. In the year 2008, they had the Olympic. But then I was a proud Chinese. I cheered whenever Chinese got the gold medal. Everyone in the world cheered for China's achievement. In the year 2014, 2015, the UK government coined the term of golden era. It really means that the UK government back then wanted to have a warm and nice relationship with the Chinese government. But look at decades of engagement, what we have left are millions of people living in modern-day concentration camp, forced labors, Hong Kong protests being cracked, thousands of my friends in jail. And China, when Xi Jinping talks about win-win situation, it means that China wins twice. They are dominating world's economy, but also exporting their authoritarianism, and we've got ample of evidence of it. So when we talk about partners, when we talk about adversary, we're not partnering with someone who has the power, has the economic superiority, because they could use those things to do bad things. We are partnering with like-minded allies to promote our mutual beliefs, to promote our democratic values, because we believe in inner dignity, freedom, and democracy, and that is why we have to see it as an adversary. That's why we have to make it strict, that we're doing it for global democracy and for future generations, and for the people who still vote, who could still speak freely, and who could still live from fear. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all four of our speakers tonight for making their cases so powerfully. The talking on this side of the room is now over. It's time for the audience to decide, so please do now submit your final vote for or against the motion. It's time to treat China as an adversary and not a partner. You can vote using the same link you used earlier for the pre-vote, so either the link you received in the email or the QR code behind us if you're in the room. If you're watching via the live stream, it's the little poll button on the right of the screen. Please do vote for or against the motion. If you're still not sure, please do vote undecided. We'll bring you those results any minute now. Just a quick reminder before we do, though, of where we began. At the start of this event, before anyone had heard the speakers, 53% of the audience was for the motion, was for treating China as an adversary, 22% were for treating China as a partner, and 25% were undecided. So it'll be interesting to see where we get to. In the meantime, if you would like to tweet about tonight, please do, using the hashtag IQ2. If you want to continue the debate, so apologies for anyone who didn't get their question in, do carry on Twitter, and we'll all between us try to answer if we can, but keep the argument going. We should have the results for you any minute now. Before we do, though, I just wanted to thank our speakers again tonight. So Nathan Law, Alan Mendoza, Shirley Yu, and Vince Cable. Thank you very much for joining us. We haven't quite got the results yet. This is sort of the moment where the countdown clock is ticking. The tension is rising. We should know any second. Oh, here we are. So the post results are a triumph for the motion. 69% of the audience here are for treating China as an adversary. 23% are for treating China as a partner, and only 8% now are undecided. So thank you all very much for voting and for contributing and for sending in your questions wherever you were. It's hugely appreciated.